In many ways, the modern Middle East, as I've said previously, was shaped by events that occurred in and around the First World War. However, if you want to see what many people sort of look to as, in quotation marks, the problems that the Middle East has in the contemporary period, you can also examine intensely the post World War II period, which will provide you with certain nuances on this matter. The things that Galvin outlines, what he calls the new ruling bargain, are his perspective, and to be very frank, could be argued by many people. But I will lay them out for you and give some comments on them and then see how they relate to what we've already been speaking about. So, Galvin's roots of the new ruling bargain, what he describes as the reason why certain ruling groups in the wider Middle East are the way they are. He gives five factors. First is the classical, what he has called defensive developmentalism, which we've already seen under the Ottoman Empire, Qajar Iran, numerous states in North Africa, as well as Kemalist Turkey, Pahlavi Iran, uh, Persian Gulf states, etc. The other is imperialism, which we have spoken about, how the imperial order and European, particularly British, French, to some degree Italian and Spanish influence in the region affects the way in which ruling cadres, ruling classes are created. But there's three other things we haven't spoken about as much and really are tied into this, the readings that we'll examine after this. One of those is what we call the post-war economic system. And in this case, I mean the post-World War II economic system. The dominance of the United States, the emergence of the Soviet Union, and these two factors below, what they call the IMF and the World Bank, these become economic systems and economic measures that the new or emerging states of the Middle East have to deal with and have to find a way in which to deal with them. And the last of these is a trend which is a global trend that profoundly affects the Middle East, but also other places: decolonization. After the Second World War, Britain and France and Italy and many others no longer were able or felt that they could not hold on to their colonies, at least in any substantial way. Small territories, perhaps, but large territories became increasingly difficult to be governed from afar. And so decolonization also strikes the Middle East. As I've said previously, and as Galvin says in this section, these are numerous things that have occurred over a 125-year period. It's not as though all of these simply emerge post 1945. They've been occurring for quite some time, and they will continue to occur and arguably are still continuing to occur. And so, factors for the recent trends, as I said, when we come to the post World War II economic order, and that is what Galvin lays out as the Bretton Woods Agreement. So, for those of you that are unfamiliar, in and around the end of the Second World War, numerous countries, about 40 or 45 in all, came to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States, a ski resort in New Hampshire, and they came up with a kind of monetary / economic agreement which put the United States in a dominant position. Not in the only position, but in a dominant position. This challenged what had been another trend, especially in the modern Middle East, which is what they call the New International Economic Order, which was less focused on colonies and was focused on internal economic development amongst Middle Eastern states. So that's a trend that we will see moving forward. Engaging with the international economy, what we might call globalization, versus self-strengthening, the old term we used before, or Galvin's term, defensive developmentalism, and trying to create a domestic economic order. What in some ways ends the Bretton Woods Agreement or begins to problematize the Bretton Woods Agreement is what many people call the oil shock of 1973-74 as a result of what's also known as the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This is one of the major wars of Israel with its Arab neighbors, particularly Egypt, but also Syria and a few others. So this oil shock results in the massive uptick of oil and petroleum products from a relatively inexpensive product to an incredibly expensive product. This gives some of the Middle Eastern states a moment in which they have a dominant economic position. However, because of this, many outside of the region, particularly the United States, as well as European states, Japan, and others, begin to really question the importance of oil and their reliance upon foreign oil, and this causes a economic/political shakeup. There's also a greater distrust of the Gulf states, a greater distrust of Arab states, and there begins to be tension that's built in to the region. The third one, which Galvin outlays, which I would again problematize to some degree, is this term which you may have heard before, or perhaps you haven't, what they call neoliberalism. This can be used in a objective context, but oftentimes it's used today in a pejorative context, in a negative sense, particularly by Marxist historians or by, in quotation marks, progressive economic-minded interests, that somehow the old liberal order has been corrupted and that neoliberalism is a sort of corporate version of the old liberalism. So using a very simplistic definition of this, old liberalism was where business interests saw the need or the value in supporting societies and spending money on them. Neoliberalism is a more banal, profit-driven liberalism that doesn't see a lot of benefit in things like higher wages for workers, labor unions, public services, etc. Of course, this is very simplistic, but you do see more of this after the late 1970s and certainly by the 1980s. And this is really compounded by a moment in time which perhaps many of you have not thought about as a sort of driver of not only global but world politics, the sort of global economic crisis of 1979 to 1982. What is sometimes known as the W-shaped recession, or what I like to call the double tap recession, where there's a recession and a brief respite from it, and then another recession. This undermines dramatically the price of oil, and it creates all kinds of issues regarding global finance, and it really begins to sort of undervalue many of the economies in the Middle East. Many of them begin to lose out. These shape the ruling interests in the Middle East. So the Bretton Woods system, very, very quickly, is that the majority of world currency outside of the Soviet Union and communist China become pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar becomes pegged to gold. It's a simple, easy transactional system that's created in order to encourage the revitalization of Western Europe and parts of East Asia, and it dramatically benefits the United States. It's signed in a ski resort up here in Vermont, and for many people, it is the sort of gold standard of the 20th century's economic system. All of these gentlemen appear, and they create a system that's workable, but remember, for other groups, and you can look at the people who are involved here, for other people, a place like Saudi Arabia, or Iran, or Tunisia, or Turkey, they're sort of left out of this bargain, and it really becomes a Western Europe, United States, Japan decision. Later, the Soviet Union also backs out. Initially, they're involved, and later they back out. So it's a global system that benefits the old imperial powers and its global economic dominance without imperialism to some degree. And imperialism fades, not necessarily always dramatically, but gradually fades between 1945 and 1971 to 75. Anywhere after the mid-1970s, imperialism and European influence in the region is gone. And as it abates, as it goes away, the powers that fill that vacuum have lots of challenges that they have to deal with. And particularly here in the so-called mandatory states that emerge after 1945-46, these are particularly problematic. Although these rebellions you see here and these interests were against European powers, in the 1960s and the 1970s, we see rebellions against the new state governments in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Beirut, and in Amman. And of course, these sort of what we've already mentioned, the Palestine-Israel issue. That leads us to one of these other factors that defines us, the 1973 war, or the Yom Kippur War, between Egypt, Syria, and Israel, as well as others. Israel wins the war yet again. Arab nationalism or pan-Arabism is shattered. Israel formally occupies in a more dominant way the West Bank and Gaza, as well as parts of the Sinai. And Arabism and the power of pan-Arabism, Arab socialism, to defeat Israel becomes very, very sort of difficult to see as a viable thing moving into the future. And we have this recession. So we have Arab defeat in the mid-1970s. We have an oil shock or an oil crisis. And then we have this sort of wavy W or double tap recession that means that the Middle East economy decreases dramatically. And so we'll discuss this as we move forward, talking about the effects of this in the 1980s and the effects of this on the Arab-Israeli peace process.